Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the 2021 Peach Lecture. My name is Bridget Toll. As President of the Leicester Literary and Philosophical Society and a member of the Court of the University of Leicester and former Pro-Chancellor, I would like to welcome you on behalf of both organisations, which jointly bring this biennial lecture to you. This year is both the centenary year of the university and of Harry Hardy Peach's presidency of the Lit and Phil Society. He was a man of wide vision who put the principles of the arts and craft movement into practice here in Leicester. Dryad Furniture successfully manufactured and sold cane furniture. The business evolved into Dryad Handicrafts, providing craft materials for school children and occupational therapy. But Peach's motivation in being a manufacturer was not for the thrill of being an entrepreneur, but for the changes his products brought to society. He first promoted the use of craftwork as part of occupational therapy for wounded soldiers during the First World War, recovering at the hospital, which is now the university's major building. He also wished to promote high standards of design in industry and was a co-founder of the Design and Industries Association. Peach's interests were wide-ranging. He understood that if the countryside was preserved, people's lives would improve. He not only campaigned, but took practical action to ensure change occurred. He was a founder member of the Leicestershire Footpath Society and nationally a supporter of the Commons, Open Spaces and Footpath Society. Through lectures, pamphlets, and his book, The Face of the Land, he explained his ideas about the countryside through conservation. Then it was radical to suggest controls on ribbon housing development, litter pollution, or scrap heaps. To support local amenity groups wishing to promote these ideas, Peach founded the Council for the Preservation of Rural England. In 1936, on Peach's death, a public subscription raised funds. The trust deed states that the purpose was the provision of a lecture directed towards the education of the public in the preservation and conservation of rural England, or the education of the public in the desirability of associating design with industrial affairs, or directed towards the education of the public in artistic or aesthetic outlook and progress, or any subject allied thereto or associated therewith in memory of the life and work of Harry Hardy Peach. In recent years, the lectures have explored an aspect of Peach's interests in the context of the 21st century. This year, we take to the countryside. We are fortunate to have as our speaker Craig Bennett, who is the CEO of the Wildlife Trust, which has over 850,000 members nationally, and with a strong local trust here in Leicestershire and Rutland. It is a grassroots movement of people who believe that we need nature and nature needs us. Prior to working for the Wildlife Trust, Craig was CEO of Friends of the Earth, where he refocused the organisation on its unique role of empowering communities to take action to tackle climate and ecological crisis. Craig has been described as one of the UK's top environmental campaigners, and by the Guardian newspaper as the very model of a modern eco-general. I have much pleasure in asking Craig Bennett to give the 2021 Peach Lecture on why the 2020's could and should be a decade for nature's recovery.
Well, Bridget, thank you very much. And it's a real delight to be able to join you all this evening. I'm very grateful and honoured to have been invited to deliver this year's Peach Lecture. The only shame is that we can't be together at the moment and doing this face to face. That's a real shame, because I think I would have really enjoyed meeting as many of you as possible this evening. But of course, I'm delighted that we are able to do it over Zoom instead, and that it's still able to go ahead. And I think perhaps the transformation we've seen in the last year in so many aspects of our life, sometimes for good, despite all the bad that's gone on in the last year, I think is a real indication that we can go through transformations. If even just a year ago, we might not have been able to imagine us all coming together like this to hear this lecture, but look at us now, we're doing it. And I think we need to remember that as we go through the next 50 minutes when I talk you through all the problems we face in the world, but also how actually we could and should be able to address them and solve them. It's amazing what we can do when we really put our mind to it. So I'm delighted to be able to present the Peach Lecture to you tonight. And it is on that topic about how I believe, the Wildlife Trust believe, that the 2020s could and should be a decade of ecosystem restoration. And indeed, it's been set as the UN Decade of Restoration, when we can put nature into recovery. So it's a very important job we've got to do. I found myself thinking quite a lot over the last couple of weeks as we've watched NASA do very clever things and send a probe to Mars, something that I found fascinating and I'm very enthusiastic about. And I don't want to be misunderstood here. I think it's a very human thing to do, to go and explore other planets and to discover the universe. And indeed, it was, of course, our quest to do that that produced this picture from NASA back in the 1960s from the Apollo missions, that arguably actually, in many respects, has been seen to be the birth of the modern environmental movement. That image of the Earth floating in space actually spontaneously created in so many ways a change in the zeitgeist about how people saw the world, and that birth of modern environmentalism, if you like. But I do find myself sort of reflecting about how we send a probe to Mars to explore it and potentially looking for signs of life on Mars, all a very clever and amazing thing to do. While, of course, if we look back at our own planet, we know that we're facing a climate and ecological emergency at home. And the fact is, we need to do a much better job of addressing them. Now, I'm going to assume that because you've come here tonight, you've come to this lecture, you probably know more than the basics about the status that we're in. So I'm not going to go through all the details of the crisis. I want to spend most time really talking about the solutions. But I think there are some points to emphasize in this. You might have seen this before. This has been a brilliant way, produced by climatologists, of communicating just what's happening around climate change. These stripes represent the change in global temperatures from 1850, the time of the Industrial Revolution, through to roughly present. And I think show very, very clearly the warming trend that we've seen during that time. And when people talk about the climate change as an emergency, you know, often people will say to me, what really makes it, why is it over the last few years in particular, scientists have started talking about it as an emergency and saying how incredibly urgent it is. And it's kind of surprised even those of us that have worked in this field for a long time, just how concerning the science has become in recent years. There's different ways to tell this story, but I'm just going to flash up a few scientific papers. And don't worry, I'm not going to spend the whole evening showing scientific papers at you, but I'm sure you're familiar with how conservative scientists can be sometimes. So when you see really stark language in scientific papers, I think we have to kind of sit up and take heed of what they're warning. This was a paper published, a peer-reviewed paper published in late 2019. And it's really extraordinary in its language. Trajectories of the Earth system in the Anthropocene. This is some of the world's very best climate scientists coming together. And just listen to this language carefully. Based on this framework, we argue that social and technological trends and decisions occurring over the next decade or two, the next decade or two, could significantly influence the trajectory of the Earth system for tens to hundreds of thousands of years, and potentially lead to conditions that resemble planetary states that were last seen several millions of years ago. Conditions that would be inhospitable to current human societies and to many other contemporary species. Decisions in the next decade or two. It's quite extraordinary, isn't it? I do find, actually, I have to confess, I actually rather enjoy those appalling Hollywood blockbuster movies, the disaster movies. And I'm always struck that the common theme of them is that normally you have one rogue scientist works out that the meteorite is about to hit the planet or aliens are about to invade, and it's only one scientist saying it, but they manage to convince normally the President of the United States to do something about it, and then they save the planet. In this case, we've had thousands, tens of thousands of scientists, including the very best of British science, telling us just how serious the climate emergency has been. And unfortunately, we haven't yet seen anything like the response that's been needed. But if you're wondering why they're talking in this paper about why we're moving into this state, this is another really good way of explaining it. And maybe don't worry so much about the diagram on the left, which might be a little complicated, but I rather like this diagram on the right, which shows the situation we now face, the concern that as the Earth warms, there is a danger it might in itself provoke feedback loops, and I'll come on to that in a moment, that speed up the pace of climate warming, meaning that it gets warms ever faster. The pace of warming starts to speed up all by itself, no matter what we do to cutting our emissions, which means that we could move into this hothouse Earth state. You see there, they've represented that with the Earth as a marble that is running down that gully. And really what they're suggesting is that our real last chance to try and get to a stabilized Earth, which would still be significantly warmer than it would be if we hadn't been burning fossil fuels, actually we're in the last few chances to be able to do that. And I've always thought that's quite an interesting way of demonstrating that problem. And the real concern is around those feedback loops. And perhaps you've heard of these before, perhaps not. But taking as an example, you see there the Amazon rainforest. The real concern that as the Earth warms and the Amazon dries out, that rather than being a habitat that at the moment sucks carbon out the air, as it dries out and indeed burns, that it becomes a source of extra carbon to the atmosphere. The same would be true of the permafrost in the northern latitudes, where huge quantities of carbon are stored. In fact, methane, more to the point, is stored in the permafrost. And as that thaws, that is released, so speeding up warming. And just through these feedback loops, you notice how many of them actually connect the climate and nature story. And this is the real concern, that if we pass these tipping points, and in some cases there's some evidence that we might have already started to pass them, that actually it becomes much harder for us to slow climate heating. I put this up because in a way it's sort of almost funny, apart from the fact that it's also tragic to see a scientific paper with this kind of a title on it, underestimating the challenges of avoiding a ghastly future. It's not really sort of conservative science talking, is it? But you notice here just the bit that I've highlighted. We review the evidence that future environmental conditions will be far more dangerous than currently believed. Great. This is all just to cheer up on a Monday evening. The scale of the threats to the biosphere and all its life forms, including humanity, is in fact so great that it is difficult to grasp for even well-informed experts. Sorry to bring you down at the start of the week. And here is another summary, which was published in the journal Science in 2019 by a group of very eminent biologists from around the world, really trying to understand global trends in the capacity of nature to contribute to good quality of life from 1970 to the present. And again, it might look a bit detailed. All you need to do is just see that in the left-hand column, in that table on the right, that column is nature's contribution to people. So, for example, habitat creation and maintenance, or pollination, or regulation of air quality, for example. And you notice that every single one of those, the 50-year global threat trend, all you need to notice, sadly, is that the arrows are pointing downward. So in other words, what's happened over the last 50 years is we have eroded the ability of nature to contribute to a good quality of life of humans, which doesn't seem a very sensible thing to have done. And we can look at all kinds of examples of those global declines in nature that have been caused by direct and indirect drivers of change. You see them here, all the kind of reasons this has happened, and I'm sure you'll be very familiar with them. But what are the sort of summaries? Well, 47%. Natural ecosystems have declined by 47% on average relative to their earliest estimated states. Approximately 25% of species are already threatened with extinction. 23% of ecological communities, the abundance of them, of the naturally present species, has declined. And I'll come back to abundance a lot in this talk, but the global biomass of wild mammals has fallen by 82% during that time. Quite astonishing. So real concerns there about just how severe this decline has been in the natural world, particularly over the last 50 years or so.
Yeah.
Quite shocking. Now, I'm going to just stop sharing the screen for a moment and tell you, as far as that goes, that all might be stuff that we've heard about for a long time, about the climate emergency and about the ecological emergency. But, you know, the first time I became also aware that this might be connected to our health was around 20 years ago, when I first became aware of this report. It's the Millennium Ecosystem Report, produced, strangely enough, around the time of the millennium. And that's the first time I became aware of the danger that habitat loss and habitat fragmentation could lead to the emergence of new pandemics. And at the time, it took me a while to try and understand this. But I wanted to talk about this a little bit tonight, because one of the things that's astonished me in the last year is how little media coverage and discussion there's really been about what is almost certain the cause of COVID-19 in the first place, and how actually we have contributed to it emerging. So that report, as I said, first indicated it and made it very clear that if we continued to fragment our wildlife habitats, that would lead to ever greater proximity between humans and wildlife, and that would lead to potential spillovers, which is the phrase, of pandemics, of viruses from wildlife populations into human populations. And this has been predicted now, as I said, for at least 20 years, if not before that. Of course, AIDS, HIV emerged in the 1980s, crossing over from animals into humans. And since then, since that Millennium Ecosystem Assessment was produced, of course, we've seen SARS, we've seen Ebola, we've seen NIPFA, and plenty of other pandemics as well. But of course, COVID-19 has come along, and it's the first one to have affected people globally. It's often been described that amongst scientists that perhaps COVID-19 is the first personal interaction that many people have had around the world with the global biodiversity crisis. And although it's not received very much attention in the media, it's received a little bit, but although it's not received very much attention, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, otherwise known as IPBES, has been working on this. And just last autumn, they produced this workshop summary on biodiversity and pandemics. And you can see there that, you know, they're very concerned that if we keep depleting wildlife habitats and fragmenting wildlife habitats, particularly in the tropics, that actually makes it more likely that future pandemics will emerge. So the sobering thought to leave you with tonight is that actually in the last year, because we've continued to fragment wildlife habitats, particularly in the tropics in the last year, we've actually done nothing to reduce the risk of new emerging pandemics. And although at the moment we're fighting desperately to try and get an end to COVID-19, there is nothing really to stop the next pandemic emerging. And in fact, we're making it more likely the longer we continue eroding those wildlife habitats. And on top of that, of course, trade in endangered wildlife and wildlife species and parts, and obviously international air travel makes it all worse. So I think it is important that we need a lot more attention on how to stop the next pandemic, even while we're trying to fight this one, if we're going to really learn the lessons from COVID-19. So these issues are all linked. Climate, nature, even our health are all linked inextricably to each other. And you might have seen this diagram before, perhaps. Measurements of atmospheric carbon dioxide in the Earth system back since the 1960s. And you see that trend rising as it goes from around 320, 330 roughly parts per million, perhaps 325 parts per million when I was first born in the early 1970s, to more like 420 parts per million today. A very clear trend of CO2 concentrations rising in the atmosphere. But the reason I put this up here is not to try and remind you that it's increasing. Again, I thought that anyone coming tonight would accept that. But perhaps you've wondered in the past why, if you have seen this graph in the past, why it squiggles around so much. And that for me is something that's a very important topic to reflect tonight. Because actually what you see there is, if you like, a diagram of the Earth breathing. It's the most extraordinary thing. Carbon emissions rise, and then they fall, and then they rise. And over time they keep rising because we keep burning fossil fuels. But you might wonder, why is it that they fall? It turns out it's every spring and every summer. And it's actually because of the flush of vegetation that grows across the Northern Hemisphere during the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. Because, of course, there's more land in the north. And when vegetation grows during our spring and summer in the north, it sucks carbon dioxide out the air. And then when that vegetation dies off, you see carbon emissions, carbon dioxide concentrations growing again. And I think this remarkable graph just shows, is a very good reminder of the ability of nature to restore itself and restore the planet. You know, if all we need to do essentially is quite simple, really, in concept, it's obviously much harder in delivery. But actually, if we can make sure that every year we are emitting less CO2 than nature is absorbing, then we would actually start to see carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere fall again. As I said, that's a big if, and it's hard work. But there's a lot of talk, you might have heard the phrase of trying to get to net zero, and that's very important. But bear in mind, when we get to net zero, and scientists are pretty clear that we need to do it by 2050 at the latest, and ideally we'd do it soon. If you could wave a magic wand and do it tonight, you would. So let's not forget that. But if we can, once we get to net zero, then we have to try and go net negative. We need to actually suck carbon out the air. And it's often talked about, how do we do that? Do we need to invent negative emission technologies, clever new machines that don't exist yet? Well, I would say we can obviously use the machine that has been doing it brilliantly ever really since the Earth begun, and that is nature. So the point about this lecture tonight is to remind ourselves that if we want to solve the climate and ecological emergency, and indeed the health emergency, then we have to put nature into recovery. Of course, we have to cut carbon emissions at source. We absolutely have to do that. But we also have to put nature in recovery. So how do we do that? Is it possible? Well, anyone that followed the climate debate over the years will be very familiar with the kind of graphs that have been seen about how we might try and cut emissions. And we might so-called bend the curve of carbon emissions. Well, we're a bit further behind. I would say that the biodiversity debate in many respects, and I worked a lot on climate change and I worked a lot on biodiversity, it feels to me like it's sort of 2 decades behind, really, where the climate change debate was in many respects. But just last autumn, I'm delighted that finally we saw this publication, Bending the Curve. This was in Nature Journal of Terrestrial Biodiversity. In other words, it's not enough to talk about slowing the declines of nature. And for perhaps too long, even the conservation community have been guilty of just talking about how we protect the last bits of nature. We try and slow the decline. That's not enough. We have to put nature into recovery. We have to bend the curve. And here you see estimates, Huge amount of work went into this by some of the world's leading scientists. Estimates about how that could be done, estimating recent and future global biodiversity trends resulting from land use change. What would happen in the grey unless we try and have coordinated efforts to reverse those? And then you see in the yellow different scenarios about how that might be done to actually reverse those declines and put nature into recovery. Again, all very detailed, but this is the kind of thinking that's going on globally now about how we can put nature into recovery. And there's all kinds of headlines in that, but the really exciting one that scientists have come together on, and actually now a lot more, increasingly more and more world leaders have come to conclusion of, is a big, bold target. So in the way that in the climate debate, there's been a target of trying to keep temperature rises to 2 degrees. And then as the science got worse, essentially even starker, to try and keep them to 1.5 degrees. A big focus now is to try and get 30% of the planet's land and sea in recovery by 2030. And just last month, more than 50 countries committed to this, including the UK. And we expect that in May, when you have the United Nations meeting of the Convention on Biological Diversity, hopefully this target of getting 30% of our land and sea into recovery by 2030 will be adopted by as many countries as possible and become actually part of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Now, you might think, what on earth does all that mean for Britain? You know, we are only a tiny little island, aren't we, off the west coast of Europe. And you might think we're a green and pleasant land, and surely we don't have to do so much of it. Surely he's talking about all the loss of tropical rainforests or whatever. Or you might even think, well, we've lost so much of our nature already, it's not worth trying. I meet people that think both of those things. Of course, there's a real problem with the loss of nature globally. But what I would say, first and foremost, we are the country where the Industrial Revolution started. It is unbelievably important that we are able to try and set an example and put nature in recovery in this country. It's incredibly important that we are able to demonstrate that an industrialized country can actually bend the curve on the loss of nature, and indeed restore nature to help nature, people, and fix the climate all at the same time. But it's also essential because, and you might not know this, actually the UK sadly is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. This is a very important graph showing the percentage of what proportion of species that were once there are still there within the UK. And you can see we've lost an awful lot. So it's no big surprise that in perhaps central London, there's less than 50% of the species that were once there now remaining. But isn't it astonishing how really across big swathes of the country, we've already lost a big proportion of our species that we would have once had in the UK. And we've also seen huge declines in abundance as well. So I think this is something that, again, has been underplayed by the nature conservation community perhaps over the last 100 years. We've often talked about the loss of species and extinctions, but actually when you lose the abundance, in other words, the number of animals in a particular population, that of course dramatically affects the role that that species can play in the ecosystem. And this report, published in late 2019 by a big coalition of NGOs, including the wildlife trusts, pulled together a huge amount of data and was able to show that 41% of our wildlife species have declined in abundance in the last 40, 50 years. And in some cases, we've seen like a 50% decline of, for example, our insect populations and some of our pollinators. In other words, they've halved how well they can pollinate our crops in the last 40, 50 years. That doesn't seem a very sensible thing for us to do. So I would say we've got to try and reverse the decline in the abundance of those species. Now, why has this happened? A whole number of reasons, of course, and it's complicated, and it'd be wrong to point the finger in any one direction. But this is a photo I took just a couple of weeks ago, and I live in Cambridge, and this is a farm close to me. And it sort of symbolises in many respects, if you like, some of the challenges that we face. Because most likely this has happened predominantly in my lifetime. I like to think it wasn't my fault, but who knows? And what you've seen here is a field that would have been once many, many fields here. And the hedgerows have been grubbed up. It's been turned into one colossal field for mechanisation. And the hedgerows that would have once been corridors for wildlife are gone. Almost certainly there's also been a huge number of chemicals and pesticides used on it that's killing a lot of the wildlife. And essentially this is now a green desert. Very little benefit for wildlife there. And so that is just one of the many drivers as to why we've seen this decline in abundance. And we have to find a way of reversing that. So we adopted the target last year at the Wildlife Trust that we are going to have this North Star, if you like, of a campaign over the next 10 years and working on the ground to try and make sure the UK delivers on this commitment of restoring 30% of our land and sea for nature by 2030. And now I've done the miserable bit and told you what the problem is. We're going to focus on how we try and solve this. So what does this look like in England? Well, at the moment, around 13% of England are protected sites. So sites of special scientific interest or local wildlife sites, 13% of England. It's worth saying around half of those are in a poor condition, so not actually as good for wildlife as they could or should be. The government has already acknowledged that we need some additional land, some more land for nature. They've set that out in their 25-year environment plan. But we would estimate that additional land is needed then to get us to around 30%. So you can see the figures about what we're looking at there. There's a big job to do to make more space for nature in the years ahead. And there was a big report published about 10 years ago by Professor John Lawton after a big review, and he summed it up brilliantly. Yes, we need to make more space for nature, but it's not just the quantity. It needs to be bigger, better, more joined up. Now, what does that look like in practice? How could we potentially deliver that? Well, here's an example from Staffordshire Wildlife Trust, not so far from where you are in Leicestershire. And this is the work they've been doing to develop a nature recovery network. And a nature recovery network is something the Wildlife Trust have been advocating for many years now. And we're delighted that the government has accepted this. And a requirement to create and deliver a nature recovery network is in the Environment Bill, which is currently going through Parliament, although it is delayed. But the idea about this is to make sure that we join up the remaining habitats that exist through wildlife corridors, to filling in the bits in between, and for creating bigger space. This is what nature needs to put nature in recovery. And that's the first step that's required. And so right across the country, over the next couple of years, 2-3 years, as the Wildlife Trusts, we're going to be working with other stakeholders to try and identify that nature recovery network. And one of the things that does then is it's about us filling in the gaps between the current reserves. So at the Wildlife Trusts, I could not be prouder that we actually have more nature reserves in the UK than McDonald's has restaurants in the UK. One of my favourite statistics. And in fact, we have around 1,000 more nature reserves than McDonald's has restaurants. I know it's a funny comparison, but it's one I quite like. And we estimate that 60% of the British population live within a 3-mile walk or cycle ride around nature reserves. But in a funny kind of way, I almost want us to have fewer because I want to join up the ones we've got. The thing is, many of them are very, very small. And many of our designated sites, the government's designated sites, are very small. So what we want to do is an example of what's happened here. This is in Hampshire, where Hampshire Wildlife Trust have been able to buy land, degraded arable land in between different reserves, and essentially create one much bigger reserve. And that's much more resilient and much more beneficial for nature. And actually, there's a lot of sort of quite low quality agricultural land around the UK now, which isn't much necessarily delivering a huge amount for food productivity, which could and should become available for putting nature in recovery. And of course, we should remember there's no real such thing as food security if nature is in decline anyway. We also talked about bigger. And here's an example of what the Wildlife Trust is doing to deliver nature at the bigger scale. This is from North Cambridgeshire, where the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire have their amazing project of the Great Fen. And this has already been going for about 10 years and is really a 50-year vision. What you see there highlighted on the left aerial map, highlighted in green, if you know it, is Woodwarton Fen, which is almost like a kind of religious place for the Wildlife Trust, because it's where Charles Rothschild first created the concept of nature reserves. And this was our very first nature reserve back in the very early 1900s, when he saw the degradation that was happening to fens from agriculture, principally in the early 1900s. And he bought this and protected it by trying to keep the water levels in it high. And in the top left corner, you also see Holme Fen, which was another bit of protected fen. But for these to last long term, and indeed to deliver what's needed for nature, you need to create a much bigger area. And so our long-term project there is the area identified in red, where over time we hope to buy up farms and buy up land and work in partnership with other landowners to create the Great Fen. And you have a sort of artistic impression that on the right of large areas of wetted fen, where actually we're putting nature into recovery. And the project is already well underway. I've been there a few times, and it's astonishing to see it. It's essentially wetting the landscape, and we're starting to see that fen habitat coming back. And what's really exciting is when we're starting to be able to measure that rather than emitting carbon into the air, which it had been doing before. In fact, can you believe fen agriculture is one of the greatest sources of emissions, where roughly around a quarter of emissions from all agriculture in the UK come from fenland agriculture. But if we can get these areas wet again and actually turn them into wet peat that's sucking carbon out the air again, actually they start sucking that carbon out and locking it in place. And already we estimate that the project is sucking out carbon out the air equivalent to 25,000 households, but that will grow as the Great Fen continues to grow. And what's really exciting is we're also in places trialing so-called wet agriculture in this, because we know there needs to be a sustainable future for farmers in this kind of situation as well. So we're trying a range of different crops, working with farmers to actually see what wet agriculture could look like, to see what alternatives there are for the future in a way that you can have nature-friendly farming in this landscape. And I'm sure many of you will recognize this. This is, of course, Leicestershire. And this has been provided to me by Leicestershire and Rutland Wildlife Trust, who are also going to be doing their own mapping of a nature recovery network for Leicestershire. This shows sites of special scientific interest in Leicestershire. So that would be your starting point for where you might look for a nature recovery network, but you can see they're quite fragmented. This is when you add in other wildlife habitats. And you can start to see, you can still see a lot of dots that are separated from each other, fragmented from each other here. The idea of a nature recovery network for Leicestershire would be to essentially join the dots as much as you possibly can, create some bigger areas for nature, to put nature into recovery and join the dots. But there's another part of this. It's not just about those areas. It's that we should see that nature everywhere has the ability to restore. And a debate that has bounced around a lot over the last decade, but one which I think is getting real increasing credence now, is about how so often we are assaulting nature almost when we there's no reason to at all. A classic example is our roadside verges. You know, there are right across the country, we see roadside verges sometimes being mowed to just a few millimeters of grass when there's really no need to do it. It's costing local authorities a huge amount of money to do so. And if we don't mow them and let them grow wild and perhaps seed them with wildflower seeds, they can become incredibly important wildlife habitats. It's worth noting that Dorset County Council has saved hundreds of thousands of pounds by not mowing its verges, and in the process has also created new wildlife habitats, and people love them. Now, there's a lot of things here about the psychology that's got to be done right so that people get on board with it. You need to be able to explain that this is what you're doing. Just even a few signs to say that it's being left wild for nature is really helpful in people understanding that that's what's happened rather than it's been neglected, if you like. There's also been research shown that where local authorities and others have done this, universities on campuses and so on have left areas to go wild and seeding them as wildflower meadows. It sounds counterintuitive, but if you mow a short little narrow footpath through them, then people know that it's been done on purpose rather than by accident. And then people embrace it and celebrate the change. So fascinating psychology about it. But we would see this as all opportunities at every scale. You know, we can talk about putting nature back into recovery at big scale, but equally putting it close to where people live at a local level is incredibly important so that people can get their daily dose of nature. And this is all helping connect up those wildlife habitats. I took this photo yesterday. It's very close to where I live, just on the outskirts of Cambridge. And this is a classic example of one of those tiny little local nature reserves. It's called Nine Wells. And it really is what you see there. That is it, basically. Can you believe that's a local nature reserve? And it's protected because historically that's where there were there still are 9 wells dug out the chalk just south of Cambridge. And it's where the water for Cambridge once came and still comes in many respects. But if you know Cambridge at all, flows into the famous Hobson's Conduit and then down Trumpington Street through the centre of Cambridge. But I mean, you don't need to be an ecologist really to look at that and think, clearly that's not going to be resilient long term. You know, this tiny oasis in an otherwise agricultural desert. If you look at it from the other side, you can see just how close it is to the outskirts of Cambridge. That's the world famous Adam Brooks Hospital, for which we have so much to be grateful for, particularly the last year. But what I find interesting about this is looking from within that nature reserve, that local nature reserve, back towards town. And I find myself looking at that field and thinking, that field doesn't really make a huge difference to the food security of the UK, but it would make a phenomenal difference to that nature reserve and actually to the people of Cambridge if that could be allowed to be put into recovery. And it's a good example to explain the concept that we've come up with at the Wildlife Trust this last year, which we call Wild Belt. The idea that we need to start making more space for nature, particularly in and around our towns and cities, to expand out from our current nature reserves and create a ring of nature around our towns and cities. We have Green Belt, and of course that's incredibly important, but we can perhaps overlay Wild Belt on top of areas of Green Belt and out into the wider countryside as well to actually make sure that we are putting nature in recovery as well. And we shouldn't forget that we need to do this with the marine environment as well. It's often said that 50% of the UK's biodiversity is found in the marine environment. And this is an example of where there's been dredging for scallop fishing, and it's caused devastation to our marine environment. But if we can create marine protected areas where actually we stop some of the extractive activities, and actually we have around 30% of our marine environment currently designated, but they're paper parks at the moment. We actually need to stop the dredging within them. Then nature can recover. And these are examples of the extraordinary corals that we have. These are in British waters. We have an extraordinary marine biodiversity in British waters. And then we can put nature into recovery there. But that's so much about finding the new space for nature, for bigger, better, more joined up nature. That's very important. But we need to also restore the abundance of nature. I showed you the graphs previously of how we've seen that decline in abundance for nature. But we need to restore the abundance of nature. And a classic example are our insects and our pollinators. I said before that it's estimated in general, and of course it varies for different species, but we've lost around half of the abundance of our insect species in the last 40, 50 years. And this is one of these extraordinary things where back in the 1950s, say in the 1940s, people would have routinely seen snowstorms of moths, if you like, at night. I myself in the 1970s, 1980s, I remember going on family holidays, and at the end of the holiday, at the end of the drive up the A1 or whatever, the car windscreen and the number plate would be covered in squashed insects. That doesn't really happen now. And that is just a mark of how much we've lost the abundance of our insects. And that means we've lost the ability of them to do the job that they do, including, of course, our pollinators. But it's actually true of all species. You know, the murmurations, the beautiful murmurations, are actually much smaller now than they once were in general. And this is actually so important. So the abundance of nature is important, of course, for making sure nature is working and doing the job it needs to do for us, but also just the sheer joy and wonder of nature. Of course, so much of it is wrapped up in abundance. And let's not forget again about the marine environment. Again, it's worth bearing in mind that about 400, 500 years ago, you would have seen the North Sea so-called boiling with fish. Do you know that cod would grow there up to 3 meters long? Quite incredible to imagine that. But cod would grow up to 3 meters long. And now we've overfished so much those oceans, including the North Sea, that we have a slight improvement in our fish stocks and we think they've recovered. But of course, it's nothing like recovering to a natural state. So we would say we need a real focus on trying to restore the abundance of our species. And yes, that might mean trying to halve pesticide use, for example, in the next 10 years. But it also might mean leaving areas of our coast where fish can restock, for example. But a real focus around restoring the abundance of nature will be incredibly important. And it can be done. This is an example of lobsters recovering in abundance in one of those marine protected areas, in one of the very few where you actually have no fishing in this country. But crucially, we need to get nature working again. We need to have it functioning for us. And a good example of this is around our peat bogs. And our peat bogs are the most spectacular habitats. You know, the Prince of Wales once described our peat bogs as the UK's tropical rainforests. And it's a very good description, I think, partly because just how fantastic they are. Secondly, because of how important they are in the carbon cycle and the water cycle when they're working, but also, sadly, how they've also been really degraded and fragmented. And it's estimated that 80% of peat bogs in this country are in a degraded state, which means they're not doing the job for us that they could or should be doing, which would be so helpful. And here you see an example of that degraded peatland in Yorkshire, dried out, and again, actually emitting carbon to the air rather than sucking out the air, which is what our peat bogs should be doing. Of course, this also means when it's like this, that it erodes much more easily and water rushes off the peat bog far more quickly, and it causes flooding downstream as well. So it's not a good place to be. So the Wildlife Trust, we've already been working hard over many years to restore as many of our peatlands as we can. And this is a programme by the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust called the Yorkshire Peat Partnership. And you see there, what we've been doing is essentially blocking up some of the drainage areas and getting the peat bogs wet again. That means they're less likely to catch fire. It also means that you can actually hopefully start to get sphagnum moss growing again. And when you get sphagnum moss growing again, these peat bogs are incredibly good at building that wildlife habitat, incredibly important for, yes, for wildlife, but also incredibly important for sucking carbon out the air again. And these are all examples of the nature-based solutions that we at the Wildlife Trust think is so important and so critically links this nature and climate story. There's many examples of them. And over the last few years, there's been a lot of attention about trees and tree planting. And yes, of course, trees have a huge role to play. We think around 1 billion tonnes of carbon are locked up in the UK's woodlands, and mostly in actually the soils, not so much in the trees themselves. And planting more woods and allowing, in particular, natural regeneration, which I think should always be the preference, really, with some perhaps minimal planting, could lock up more carbon. But it obviously has to be done carefully. It has to be done where trees would be present. But you can see there's so many other nature-based solutions as well. You see there's seagrass, salt marsh, biomass carbon. In other words, that abundance again. We should remember that actually if we can replenish our fish stocks, that again is sucking carbon out the air. And of course, our wetlands, including our peatlands and even our grasslands, incredibly important for holding carbon. So there you can see this is a natural regeneration of pine forest in Scotland. This is restoration of a salt marsh being done by Essex Wildlife Trust. Fabulous, beautiful landscape. And that's helping us tackle climate change and the impacts of climate change. But of course, I can't go through this lecture without also showing a picture of a beaver or two, spectacular animals. And we do need to see some species reintroduced as well. Beavers are British. They're as British, I said recently to a newspaper, as British as Shakespeare. And for us not to have beavers in this country just means a big part of Britain is missing. A big part of our culture is missing. A big part of our natural fauna is missing. And beavers are, of course, fantastic ecosystem engineers. And if we can reintroduce beavers, then they will do a brilliant job for us of putting nature into recovery. And there's many other species like this. Another part of it is our wonderful chalk streams. And again, this means we've got to be careful not make sure they're being over abstracted so that actually we can see nature functioning again. Other work being done by the Staffordshire Wildlife Trust is actually renaturalising our river channels. And this was the River Trent I'll just put it back in the middle of Stoke-on-Trent around Victoria Ground, and some brilliant work they've done just in the last year or so in renaturalising the river channel there, which again creates new space for nature. And of course, all that helps build resilience as well. The more nature we have, essentially, the less flooding we would expect downstream. That's the simple summary. So all of this nature actually helps protect our communities as well. We're not just thinking about it out in the countryside as well, because actually the more that we can, if you like, rewild our towns and cities, the better that is for people. And you might have seen this in the press just before Christmas, an amazing, fantastic project by Nottinghamshire Wildlife Trust. They've put in a proposal, a planning proposal, if you like, to replace the old Broadmarsh shopping centre with this wonderful wild area in the middle of Nottingham, which of course would be fantastic for people to give a bit of green space for people in the middle of Nottingham. This is incredibly important. And we know that people's proximity to nature is incredibly important for their health and well-being. This is shown, this is a paper from the Lancet, obviously the medical journal. And look, that's what it does. The evidence is really clear. That's what exposure to local green space does for your mortality rate. I mean, it's a no-brainer really that we need to create more green space in and around our towns and cities. And of course, I think this last year, people have become very aware of that during lockdown. And this is, of course, particularly important for young people, the ability to connect with nature. Again, it's been shown to be incredibly important for their physical and mental well-being. And the final thoughts I want to leave you with is this doesn't have to be done just by organisations like the Wildlife Trust and others. Everyone can get involved in putting nature into recovery. I'd like to invite you tonight to think about trying to make sure that around 30% of your garden is left to go wild. You can be part of that. The leaders have pledged it. Why don't we all pledge it as well to try and get 30% of our garden wild? And while we're talking about it, it's worth bearing in mind the benefit of this is around weeding. You know, if you don't like weeding, remember a weed, the dictionary definition of a weed is only a plant that's growing where you don't want it. So in other words, a rose is a weed in a wheat field and wheat is a weed in a rose garden. So the way I do the weeding, you'll be pleased to know, is sit in my deck chair and decide everything's welcome. Or one of the best things you can do is build a mini wildlife pond. And it has to be a tiny one, will make a huge difference for wildlife in your garden. But it's a timely day today to talk about this, because today we have joined up with a huge range of other organisations, not least the National Trust, the RSPB and the Woodlands Trust, to call for nature's recovery by 2030. I said the Environment Bill is going through Parliament at the moment. Unfortunately, it was delayed by government. We thought it would become law by now, but it's been delayed. So we're now taking that opportunity of a delay to push for legally binding targets to get nature into recovery by 2030. And all these organisations are working together to do it. So I'd urge you, please go online tonight, Google for that, call for nature's recovery by 2030 and take that action, sign that petition to sign up for this. Because we believe we can get this, and it is absolutely essential to make sure the UK is focused on that and that it becomes a legally binding target in that bill. This is all going to be important to stop those declines of nature occurring. Crucially important, we reverse that decline, and rather than seeing declines, start to see nature soar again. And I'll give you this thought to close. You know, nature, often in my career, it's been talked about protecting the environment, protecting nature as somehow some kind of barrier to progress. Sometimes I've even been heckled before now. I've been told when advocating these kind of things, this is all very well, but you can't stop progress, is the phrase. Well, I think that couldn't be more wrong, because I think actually surely learning to live fairly within environmental limits, learning how we can heal nature and put nature into recovery, surely that is the next step of human progress. And if it's not, what is it? Because the scientists are really clear that if we don't put nature into recovery, if we don't tackle the climate emergency, if we don't actually do that to improve people's health and well-being, there might not be a next step of human progress. So, putting nature into recovery, tackling climate change, doing that urgently within the next decade, that, I think, is the next step of human progress. So let's get on with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Craig. That was both inspiring and practical. I shall remember particularly about the gardening, of course. So now let's move on to our question and answer section. And thank you to everyone who has submitted questions through Eventbrite. So we have a few questions, and the first one is, Craig, what should planning departments do to protect and promote wildlife in new building developments?
Yeah, it's a very good question and a very timely one. The first thing to say is planning has an absolute crucial role to do in doing just that. We need planning system to protect the wildlife we've still got left, and also to help create more space for nature. So that means, strict protection really of those local wildlife sites and sites of special scientific interest, the designated sites, but also recognizing that there are many really important areas for wildlife that aren't designated yet. It's the sort of scrappy, messy bits sometimes of our cities, the brownfield sites, that are actually incredibly important for nature. And we need to recognize that and protect them. We also need to make sure that when new developments are built, that actually there's a net gain for biodiversity. And this will be regulated in one form in the Environment Act, a requirement on developers to produce biodiversity net gain. And that's good, but it needs to be as close as possible to where the new development is taking place. And of course, that new development should still not take place if that's going to damage a really important wildlife habitat. But we do think that we need to cut through that and do it in a way that people can understand, which is one of the reasons the Wildlife Trust have proposed this new designation called Wild Belt, so that we can actually see how Wild Belt can be used to build up that totalizer, if you like, towards 30% of our land and sea by 2030 being protected for nature. And we can actually start to see nature putting in recovery in and around our developments, close to where people live. And surely that's a very positive vision about how we can do that.
Indeed, thank you. So now a question about farming. How do you see farming and food production change in this new pandemic scenario?
Well, again, it's a very timely one because, of course, even without the pandemic context, there was a huge change taking place to farming policy in this country because of our leaving the European Union. Now, I said that actually agriculture has been the biggest driver of biodiversity loss since the early 1970s. But I would say the problem has never really been farmers. The problem has been farming policy, which has really failed to properly protect nature and put nature into recovery during that period. And of course, if farmers can be supported and incentivized to protect nature and put nature into recovery, then that's what will happen. Now, we at the Wildlife Trusts, along with many other organizations, again, working in partnership with the National Trust, RSPB and others over the last few years, pushed hard for the argument that as we had a change to agricultural policy, that if taxpayers' money was going to be spent and used to subsidize agriculture, then it should be, the public money should always be used for public goods. In other words, let taxpayers' money pay for the things that the market won't pay for. In other words, if the market pays for food, we don't need to pay for that. The market can pay for that. use taxpayers' money as subsidies to pay for example, protecting the environment. And that argument was broadly won. And so the agricultural bill became the Agricultural Act just before Christmas, does recognise that. However, the important thing now is whether there will be enough money through the new agricultural transition to allow this at scale. And without getting into too many of the complexities, there are sort of three tiers in this. There's one, a basic tier of supporting farmers to, it's called the Sustainable Farming Incentive. Some debate about how sustainable it really is. Then there's another one called Local Nature Recovery, which is the next best one. And then the best one of all is support for landscape scale change, which would be what's really needed to put nature into recovery. And there's a lot of debate at the moment about essentially how much money there is likely to be at each of those levels. So that's one thing to watch. The other thing to say is we do need to recognise that to enable this to happen, there will need to be a shift in change to diets. Now, I'm not about to say that everyone should go vegetarian. I myself do eat meat occasionally, but it's going to be better for our health and better for the climate and better for nature if we can try and eat less but better meat. And the Committee on Climate Change, for example, is estimating, predicting and saying what's required is for us roughly to eat about 20% less meat by 2050 in this country. And some people would say we can cut more than that. And of course, the trends are already pointing that direction as well. But that would help free up some more space for nature. So that's part of it as well. I think where the pandemic comes in this has been kind of quite interesting, because although there's been a lot of focus around how during the pandemic, city centres have perhaps lost out, high streets have lost out, and my heart goes out to people in businesses that have lost out in that regard. Actually, we have seen a real boost, of course, in some of our suburbs, the local economy in suburbs, where people have been working at home, and little corner shops and local food stores and so on that in our suburbs are suddenly finding people working from home and using them that never did before. And I think it just gives us a hint about how we can create some more local food networks and use more local supply chains in our food system in the future. I think there's a lot that has changed for good, really, as a result of the huge changes over the last year. And we would be wise to try and lock in some of those shifts to supporting more local economies, including local food economies.
Thank you. So a question now around the role of the Wildlife Trust. How can the Wildlife Trust help in plugging gaps in existing laws? We have in recent months had a nationwide badger culling, hare coursing is on the loose, and the new high-speed train is still going ahead through protected areas.
Well, what I would say is for many, many years, the Wildlife Trust have been at the forefront of trying to create laws that do a better job of protecting nature. And we've had some great wins in that regard. I mean, 25 years ago, at the very start of my career, I was campaigning at Friends of the Earth, as it happens, around getting better protection for wildlife in what became the Countryside and Rights of Way Act. And the one organisation I worked most closely with during that time was the Wildlife Trusts. And we worked very hard together to try and get those better laws. And it was a step forward at the time. But it's always little steps forward and never quite enough, which is why then, since then, we've been campaigning very hard for this new Environment Act. It is, as I said, going through Parliament at the moment, and it contains so many of the measures that the Wildlife Trusts have been campaigning for over many years: a nature recovery network, biodiversity net gain, and a duty really to try and put nature into recovery. So that's all there. Is it enough? Of course not. We always need more. So the more that you can get involved in the likes of the Wildlife Trusts or other organisations, then the more we were able to do to shift the debates on that. And again, we need to do it in the marine environment. We led the campaign for marine protected areas as well about 10 years ago and secured that through the Marine Act, but it's not good enough. So what I would say is, if you want to see those laws changed, if you want to see better protection for nature, please get involved in your local wildlife trust, Leicestershire and Rutland Trust, or elsewhere, or get involved with other NGOs. That's great as well. But please, get involved, take action, do something, and together we'll keep making sure that we can try and ratchet up the protection for nature.
Thank you. Now, about hedgehogs, my childhood favourite. The population of hedgehogs has decimated to less than 1 million. This is the result of too many humans. Can we realistically expect a recovery in nature without a reduction in the presence of humans?
Yeah, well, this is always a controversial topic. I mean, I would say, obviously, the population issue is a factor of two things. It's one, the number of people in the world, and secondly, how we go about consuming. It's not just about numbers, but obviously numbers are part of it. And obviously it's about consumption as well. And actually our footprint, the footprint of each of us individually. And we should recognise that those of us here in the UK have a much bigger footprint, if you like, of resources than the vast majority of people on the planet. So actually it makes it quite difficult and not quite all right for us to be seen to be pointing the finger at other countries, perhaps, when we are individually, as individuals, consuming so much more than the vast majority of people. So we have to sort of do both, really. We have to make sure that we're cutting our consumption. And when it comes to the issue of hedgehogs, actually, it's not so much about consumption, but it's about us just trying to make sure our gardens support better habitats for hedgehogs, that we have little holes in our fences so that hedgehogs can get through, that there's ways of protecting them and so on, and also out in the wider countryside as well. But on the broader point around population, there's a lot of evidence that population growth is slowing down, it is declining. It will probably, under normal trends, it will probably peak at around 9, 10, 11 billion globally. Of course, it would be better for the environment if it peaks at the lower end of that range rather than the high end of the range. And all the evidence suggests that actually, if you want that to happen, then that's about support for women's rights and support in particular of education, providing, make sure there's education provision for women and girls, and particularly around the world, and particularly in developing countries, and that will make a huge difference. So I think that's the real sort of focus of that. Here in the UK, we can take so many measures to try and help hedgehogs, particularly that wildlife-friendly gardening. So it comes back to my point there that if you have a garden and you're able to leave a third of it to go wild for nature, that will help hedgehogs.
Thank you. So to our final question, will DEFRA's environmental land management scheme be the only means of delivering wildlife protection on approximately 4 million hectares of land in England?
Yes, so environmental land management scheme was the scheme I was talking about before, which has these 3 tiers in it of the sustainable farming incentive, local nature recovery and landscape recovery, and payments, increasing payments under those to farmers to improve and try and put nature into recovery. It's obviously fundamentally important. It's a foundation for nature's recovery on agricultural land, but it's not the only issue. I was talking before about the need to restore the abundance of species. And if you take, for example, our pollinators, they've declined really primarily, I mean, partly because of loss of habitats, but also because of the use of pesticides. And actually we're using much more toxic pesticides with many more applications now than we were 10, 20 years ago. You might have heard the debate recently about neonicotinoid pesticides, and the Wildlife Trust is actually looking to bring a legal challenge against the government for their decision to try and ease their ban on that recently with respect to sugar beet. So we also believe that there needs to be a target to reduce the amount of pesticide used in agriculture, and without that, we will fail to really put nature into recovery there as well. And there's plenty of other policies, other areas as well. We need to dramatically improve nature in and around our river systems as well, and make sure that we're not over abstracting our rivers as well, and many other points as well. As ever, there's no one silver bullet, I'm afraid. It's we need many different measures, but overall it's got to be joined up by that big vision of getting nature into recovery. And we need that for our food security. We need that to tackle climate change. We need that to improve our health, as I was explaining. But perhaps as much as anything, we need it to celebrate the wonder and joy of nature, which actually, ironically, is what helps make us human.
Thank you very much, Craig, for joining us. That brings us to the end of the question and answer session. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the University of Leicester's President and Vice Chancellor, Professor Nishan Khanna Raja.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Craig, for a very timely and critical and thought-provoking talk. I think you did a very fantastic job in packing so much information in a short talk. I was really impressed. There was something for everyone to take away from your talk this evening. And as you have highlighted, we have developed a deep appreciation and respect for nature during the terrible times of this global pandemic. So it is not just the nature's recovery that is important. It is nature's role in humanity's recovery that is key. The stark reality of how nature has been depleted over time gives greater impetus to the view that with concerted effort, the 2020's could and should be the decade of nature's recovery. For our part, at the University of Leicester, we are committed to environmental sustainability and leading the way in tackling climate and ecological emergency. We have reduced carbon emissions by 52% since 2004-05, despite growing significantly in size. Our climate strategy, in fact, we discussed in the executive board this morning, includes a commitment to net zero and a divestment commitment. And we are proud that recently in some of our global rankings, we were in the top 3% for Sustainable Development Goals impact. Despite having an urban campus, we were first in one of the Sustainable Development Goals, Life on Land, due to our academic excellence and our commitment to conserving and developing biodiversity. Indeed, our grounds and gardens team have been shortlisted for a national award for the innovative approach to species enrichment, incorporating our academic expertise and student enthusiasm in implementing real solutions. You'll be pleased to hear 98% of our undergraduate courses have teaching aligned to Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm proud to say, very soon this year, we'll be launching our Center for Environmental Health and Sustainability, which aims to improve human health and the health of the environment through cutting-edge multidisciplinary research. We also house one of the major research centers on Earth observation science with more than 80 scientists leading the way, which is led by Professor John Remedios at the university. So we are doing what we can, but I think the key message that you gave us today, Craig, everyone has a part to play, from what we can do in our gardens to what we can do as a university and what we can do as a nation and what we can do as a world community. I'm particularly pleased that we are today celebrating our relationship with the Leighton Field Society with this lecture. We owe a great debt of gratitude to the Society. Indeed, our very origin emanate from the work of the Society. And it is highly appropriate that this year marks the centenary of the university. I'm delighted to welcome Bridget Towell back to the university. She has had a long and distinguished record of service to the university, joining the council of the university in 2000, becoming treasurer in 2009, and chair of council from 2013 to 2019. She championed divestment and was an early supporter of our policy. These coming months will provide many opportunities for us to celebrate our centenary together. This university was founded on the spirit of hope for a better future in the wake of the First World War. As we embarked on our second century, what better way to begin with a note of hope sounded by you this evening? Hope of an end to the pandemic and the recovery of society and of nature. Craig, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. My thanks to Leighton Field Society for arranging it and raising the profile of this important topic in the Peach Lecture. We're very proud of the association with the Wildlife Trust. And a representative from the Wildlife Trust usually attends our biodiversity working group. and we have a long and strong history of working together on the ground and in sharing knowledge. And as you said, nature's recovery is a key part of human progress. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure to have you as part of this lecture. Goodbye.